It's time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Property Podcast. It is episode 135. I'm Rob B. With me is Rob D. And Rob, we have to be on our best behaviour this week because all our staff will listen to this episode.
Yep, it's a training session as well as a podcast, multitasking. We're talking about lettings law you need to know. So there's always lots of important legal stuff that you need to be aware of as a landlord or a property investor, because you can't take it for granted that your agent will know this stuff. But in particular, lots of things have changed over the last couple of weeks. So we're going to run through all that for you today, as well as giving you a resource where if you're not happy with your letting agent, we're going to make it easier for you to complain. I'm a bit worried about sharing this one. But Rob, it's been a busy old week in our world, hasn't it?
It has. So last Thursday, we had the meetups, which was great, which we mentioned. And then the weekend just gone for us, we had our summit, which is a quarterly mastermind event where we sit down with just 16 other investors and we focus on their strategy all day. It's pretty intense. There's a lot discussed and a lot taken away from it. We always get lovely feedback and it's really, really nice and really, really rewarding. So we enjoyed it so much, Rob, that when we do our next one in February, we decided to double up and do 2 dates.
Yeah, we decided this before doing the last one. Then it got to the end of the day, and I'm always exhausted at the end of the day. It's absolutely brilliant, but I'm really tired. They're thinking, in February we're going to be doing this again tomorrow. But yeah, we are doing them. We're doing them on the 21st and 22nd of February are the next summit dates we've got. So we only do 4 a year. There's no more this year. But if you want to come to the next summit, the 21st and 22nd of February, you can take your pick. Just go to thepropertyhub.net/summit if you're interested in booking your place. But it's a really good day. And we had a lovely group last week. We always have a lovely group, I must say. Thank you if you've ever been on a summit. But it was a really great day. Talking property solidly for 8 hours, you really cannot go wrong.
Yeah, what I would say is the first quarter, it seems, is the most popular quarter, because people tend to set themselves up for the year ahead. So don't dawdle on this one. We only have 16 places a day. It's not something we can roll out to the masses, so the places will go fairly quickly. So check it out. If one date's gone, hopefully the other date's available. But as Rob said, go to thepropertyhub.net/summit and we'd love to see you there and kickstart your 2016. Right, Rob, new story of the week. This one, I've got to admit, surprised me a little when I spotted the data. First floor flats in London are the best renters, apparently.
Yeah, I put this in here because I came across this story and I wanted to get your take on it as someone who's involved in lots of projects around the country, because the data says 60% of people looking for an apartment would choose the first floor, not the ground floor. Only 5% of people want the ground floor, but 60% want the first floor, and the rest would only settle for apartments higher up. And according to this, first floor flats now have a 50% price premium over the same flats on different floors in your typical 5-story apartment block. And that really surprised me.
The data doesn't really surprise me because it's in London. If it was elsewhere, then it might be different. First floor and above, yeah, I can see why it's more popular. Ground floor and lower ground floor. In London, you can probably assume that would be the case. Outside of London, though, it's a different story. I'd say particularly in non-city centre locations. So if you're in a town location or semi-rural or something like that, if there are apartments, then ground floor actually goes really well because you've got young mums or people who are more mature, shall we say, who prefer ground floor. So in some areas, what I've seen, and what we've now both seen, Rob, with your lessons, is ground floor gets snapped up and then some of the other floors take a bit longer. So it's very regional. So I wouldn't suddenly shift all your strategy and all your plans based on the London data. But it is interesting, and I'd love to see the data for every single region and see how it varied.
Yeah, I really thought the higher up floors would be more popular in London especially. But there you go. It just goes to show how much I know. If you want to read that full story, you'll find that along with links to everything else we're talking about today in the show notes for this episode, which this week are at thepropertyhub.net/lettingslaw. Okay, let's get moving on to our topic of the week then. Lettings law you need to know. And there's a reason we've called the episode Lettings Law You Need to Know. It's because you really do. So these are all changes that have happened recently, and they're all very important. They're important if you're self-managing, but they're also important to make sure that your letting agent knows all this stuff. Because remember, as the landlord, you are ultimately responsible. So there's nothing wrong with asking some questions to make sure that they're on top of things. So lots of things all changed at the same time on the 1st of October. A whole load of new legislation came in. So we're going to run through everything for you. Just before we do that, I need to start with a few caveats because this is legal stuff and it's important. First of all, this doesn't apply to all regions. Most of this doesn't apply to Wales and Scotland because housing is devolved and so there are different laws. Much of it is actually the same, but still take what we're talking about today as being relevant primarily to England. We're also going to talk about this briefly because we don't want to go on forever and ever. And what that means is we're going to ignore certain exceptions and edge cases around these issues. So if you read about any of this online, you'll notice that lawyers are still arguing about the interpretation of all this stuff. It's one of those things where a law will come in and because of some tiny little quirk of the wording, it'll mean that if you're in one particular really niche situation, it might have unintended consequences. You're not quite sure what it means. So what that means is we're not going to cover that. We're going to stick to the general points. But do take this as just general information and get proper legal advice if you're unsure about anything, because this is really important. Do not get your legal advice from two idiots on a podcast. So with those caveats out the way, shall we get into it, Rob?
We should. Two lawyers arguing. What next? Untrustworthy estate agents? Unbelievable. Right, so number one, smoke and carbon monoxide alarms are now mandatory. Okay, so let's dig in. So first of all, smoke alarms should be on every floor with any living accommodation. So many people have smoke alarms, but just on one floor. You now have to have them on every floor. So if you have a house and there's 2 floors, you need a smoke alarm on each floor. Again, one that most people will miss, so that's why we're doing the podcast. Next up, carbon monoxide alarms need to be in any room with a solid fuel burner. So obviously this doesn't apply to any electrical fireplaces or burners that you have, but at first it did apply to gas fires, but now it doesn't. So it's just solid fuel burners. So that's a change that nearly I missed as well. So, the podcast, hopefully, if you suddenly install one of those alarms, you might save yourself some money. You don't need to do that now. So why do this at all? Well, of course, you should be motivated by the safety of your tenants, but also if you want that extra push, there's penalties of up to £5,000 if you don't get this sorted. So make sure you take action now, because this is mandatory now. This is not coming in. This is not next year. This has happened. So make sure you take action if you're self-managing. And if you're not self-managing, make sure your letting agent is taking steps to make this happen for you. Now, it's the landlord's responsibility to make sure it's working on the first day of the tenancy. You cannot just pass your tenant a smoke alarm and say, please install that. That is not enough. That doesn't protect you. You have to make sure it's installed properly. And furthermore, you have to make sure it's a tamper-proof alarm with a 10-year battery. But this is only going to cost you about £15, so there's no excuse. So yeah, it's not exactly exciting stuff, but £5,000 fine is a bit more racy, and I don't think any of us want that.
Yeah, I think it's one of these bits of legislation that it's hard to argue with, really. Plenty of things come in that are a bit weird and seem unnecessary, and we've got plenty of those coming up, don't worry. But this one, I think that is an important safety measure. It's like when they took away the wear and tear allowance. It's like, well, yeah, I kind of see why that shouldn't have been there in the first place. So can't argue with that one, and it's a nice, easy one to comply with. All modern properties will be compliant anyway, so not a big deal, but something to be aware of. Okay, the second thing that changed on the 1st of October is that there is now a new form to end a tenancy with a Section 21 notice. So if you don't know what Section 21 is, basically there are 2 ways in which you as a landlord can end a tenancy. You could either use Section 8, which relies on you proving that the tenant has done something wrong, like being in a certain amount of arrears with the rent or antisocial behaviour, or there's Section 21, which is basically that you just want it back. There's no fault on the part of the tenant, but you want the property back. Section 21 is really important for landlords because actually using a Section 8 notice can be really hard because tenants, if they want to, can be very good at getting around it and finding the loopholes. Judges don't like to make people homeless, but the beauty of Section 21 is that if you serve it correctly, there is no defence to it, so you can definitely get your property back. That's the background. What's changed? Well, there's now a new prescribed form of the Section 21 notice, and this new notice must be used for any new tenancies after the 1st of October. When I say new tenancy, that includes renewals with the same tenants if you're signing a new tenancy agreement. So if a tenancy just rolls on beyond the 1st of October and becomes periodic, you don't have to use the new form of the notice. But if you re-sign with the same tenant on a new AST, then you do need the new form. The good thing about it is that dating the notice is now easier. So there used to be all kinds of confusion about the date to put on the notice. It had to expire on the last day of a tenancy period. It was all a bit confusing, but now it's a lot more straightforward. You just need to give 2 months notice and that's it. It doesn't need to coincide with the last day of a tenancy period. So previously you had lots of notices which were accidentally invalid because people were calculating the dates wrong. Now it's a nice, easy 2 months notice. So that is a good thing. What some people will see as a bad thing is that you now can't serve a Section 21 notice in the first 4 months of a tenancy. Now, what a lot of people did was by default serve a Section 21 notice on day one of a tenancy, just in case, just so it's there. So if you need to get rid of a tenant, it's already in place and it doesn't waste any time. I've never done that. I've never liked doing it because it seems a bit weird. It's like, welcome to your new home. Here's a notice that says you have to get out at some point. It just didn't really work for me, but some people did it. But now you can't do that because you can't serve it within the first 4 months. There's also now an end date on it, which means you can't just leave it hanging over people forever. You now can't start legal proceedings more than 4 months after the expiry date on the Section 21 notice. So you give at least 2 months, and then 4 months after that date, you can't use it anymore. So that will probably all sounds a bit technical. Broadly, it does actually simplify things, or at least it will do after the transition period has happened and everyone is using the new notice. But it's important to know, because if you try and use a notice that you served on day one, or if you use the wrong form of the notice, then it's not going to stand up in court and you're not going to be able to get the tenants out. And that could potentially waste a lot of time and be very expensive. There could be an extra few months without rent by the time you've sorted that out. So important to know about this change so you can get that right. And the same applies to some of the other changes that came in, Rob.
Okay. So if that wasn't enough, there's plenty more for you. So there are barriers to ending a tenancy with Section 21. So you can't just do what Rob said previously. You have to also make sure that you provide your tenant with the following, or the Section 21 is invalid. So you need to make sure they have a copy of a gas safety certificate, if one's required. Obviously, if you have no gas appliances or any gas facilities in the property, then you don't need one. But if you do, you need to provide them with a gas safety certificate. You also need to supply them with a copy of the EPC, which you can't even market the property without an EPC. So you should have one, but you need to give this to your tenant. That's an energy performance certificate. So make sure that they have a copy. You may have done one, but you have to give them a copy of it. And of course, you have to give them a copy of the thrilling read, the government's booklet, How to Rent. They want to make sure the money they've spent on that one's going to good use. So they're the three things you need: a gas safety certificate, if applicable, an EPC report, which everyone must have, and the government booklet, How to Rent. Without them, the Section 21 is invalid. The tenant can say, I wasn't provided with one of these documents or all of them, so therefore, I'm not following it. And they can. The intention is for all this to be served at the start of the tenancy, but it seems like it doesn't need to be. At Yellow Lettings, we're attaching it to the AST, so the tenant signs to acknowledge receipt of all three. So if we ever in the future do need to serve a Section 21, we're protected because the tenants acknowledge that they've got them. It seems that it all could be just attached to the Section 21 notice, and that would allow it to be valid. But in any case, it's a separate legal requirement to provide tenants with a copy of the new gas safety certificate within 28 days and the EPC available at the point of marketing the property in the first place. So why not just do it at the start and then you're protected? So again, not exactly exciting stuff, but stuff that if you don't implement could really punish you. So I think that's the running theme of this podcast. But Rob, there's even more.
There is, and let's move swiftly on before I start going on about this stupid booklet and how it just adds to the mountain of paperwork that you have to end up handing over on day one. Let's talk instead about retaliatory evictions. That'll be more fun, won't it? So here's another barrier to using a Section 21 notice. So this came from the idea that if tenants complain about maintenance or safety issues in the property, instead of sorting them out, the landlord will just move the tenants out instead. So they try and get someone in there who's not going to complain quite so much, which obviously is not fair. So that is what this is trying to address. So there's now a process, and if this process goes the whole way through, then you're not going to be able to use a Section 21 notice for a period of time. So basically, as a tenant, you can submit a complaint to the landlord about the condition of the property, and the landlord must then provide an adequate response within 14 days. If the landlord does not provide an adequate response within 14 days, the tenant can then complain to the local authority, who must then carry out an inspection of the property. So if the local authority does that, and as a result of their inspection, they serve an improvement notice, or they even carry out emergency action themselves to sort something out. If all that happens, then any Section 21 notices that have already been served will be ineffective, and you can't use a Section 21 notice for the next 6 months. So the idea is, if there's something seriously wrong with the property, then you can't use it as an excuse to move the tenant on, because you can't use a Section 21 notice for the following 6 months. What does this mean? Well, some people are getting very upset about this and think it's all going to be very serious. Maybe it will in certain parts of the market, I don't know. But it seems to me like this isn't a big deal for a couple of different reasons. First of all, probably wrongly, but tenants will most of the time not be aware that this exists, and they won't be aware that that they need to go to the local authority to kickstart this whole thing. And also because, let's face it, you should be providing an adequate response within 14 days if someone reports something, and you certainly shouldn't be getting to the point where the local authority comes around and starts issuing improvement notices. If you're a decent landlord, that just shouldn't be happening. What the implication is, though, is that it's safest to communicate about repairs in writing, because that way you can prove that you've responded adequately. So in writing doesn't have to be a letter. It could be an email, it can be a text. At Yellow, we've got a reporting system which keeps an audit trail to protect us and our landlords. No one can say, well, I reported this, nothing ever happened. So this one, some people are getting very excited about it. I don't think it is all that important, but it would be a good idea if you're self-managing to start communicating in writing about repairs just to be safe.
So, lots of changes, all recent. What does this mean? Well, I think the first point to take away from this is, if you are self-managing, it isn't just about collecting the rent and making sure things are repaired when they go wrong. It's about making sure that you comply with all the legislation, which is pretty poorly publicised. Some of the stuff here I didn't see until Robert pointed it out to me, and it was like, wow, okay, that's changed. It's not really out there. So make sure you're aware of what's going on. Of course, when big things happen, we'll mention it on the podcast, but that probably isn't even enough as well. But that doesn't mean that you can rely on your letting agent to know either, because I imagine if you go and test your letting agent now and ask them about these changes, they might know some, but will they know them all? Hopefully. But I'd want to be checking up now to make sure they're aware of this and they've already taken action. So you can't rely on your letting agent to just do it all, and you can sit back and assume it's all being taken care of. But Rob, as we said, don't panic. Lawyers like to argue about the details, but the majority of this, while it sounds like faff and loads of red tape and a nightmare to administrate, actually most of it is fairly simple stuff if you've got good systems in place.
Yeah, it is. If you start looking into it, like you'll look at kind of law blogs and I'll be like, oh, it's going to be chaos because this word implies that in this really bizarre situation, this might mean that. And realistically, is it going to happen? In 90% of cases or more, I think is the statistic, tenancies are ended by the tenant wanting to leave rather than the landlord wanting them to leave. So that's 90% of cases out the window straight away. Of those, how many Section 21s are contested? Very, very few. This is all important to note because, of course, you need to do things properly. And, of course, you could be unlucky enough to get a tenant who knows the law inside out and is going to use it to their favour and find any excuse to get out of it. But it is very, very unlikely. So be aware and act appropriately, but definitely don't panic. If you are a good landlord and you do things properly and you reference properly, then the vast, vast, vast majority of the time, you're going to be absolutely fine. So that is a quick summary. It might not have felt quick, but it was, of what changed on the 1st of October. There'll be a summary of this in the show notes, which are at thepropertyhub.net/lettingslaw.
Okay, so it's time for our resource of the week. And thanks to Scott Elliott, someone who's been along on the summit, and we mentioned earlier, not the most recent one, but one previously. And Scott sent in a great resource, we think. Hopefully we didn't live to regret this one, Rob, but the motivation is there to carry on giving a good service in all the things we do. The website is called Resolver. It's resolver.co.uk. You can find all the show notes, all the details about the law, all the links that we're mentioning today at thepropertyhub.net/lettingslaw. That's thepropertyhub.net/lettingslaw. But Rob, this resource that we'll link to, you passed it on to me to have a look at. What have you done?
Yeah, so Scott put this our way. This is basically a website that makes it easy to complain. And Scott said, being a bit of a complainy pants myself, it's a quick way to send out a complaint to the list of companies signed up. And he's right, it's quite cool. If you've got a beef with any company, you can just pop in their name, you can put in a bit of information about what the nature of the complaint is, and it'll tell you the best way to go about getting that complaint to them. So say you've got a problem with EasyJet, it will then ask you where you departed from, because that has an impact on what their responsibilities are. It'll then ask you what your complaint was about, and it'll basically walk you through it. And then at the end, it'll either say to you, okay, you should call this number, or you should send a letter. It'll even give you template letters. And what's also really cool is it'll let you know what they have to do, or what they're supposed to do. So if you submit a complaint and they're meant to reply within 14 days, it'll remind you after 14 days to say, if you haven't had a reply, you escalate it to this next step. So it's pretty cool. It does make the whole thing easier. I often have things where I'm just like, oh, this is outrageous, I'm going to complain about this. Then I never get around to it because it's just too much effort. I'm just waiting till I'm retired in about 30 years' time, because then I'm just going to dedicate my life to complaining about stuff. But for now, I just never get around to it. And so this website does make it a lot easier.
It does. So thank you, Scott, for that one. And also a big thank you to all the people who continue to leave us a review. And this one is from Chris L. And Chris L says, a friend of mine recently asked me if I could give some advice on property investment. I have 5 buy-to-lets and began telling him that it might be useful. And then after about 30 seconds, I stopped and said, actually, just listen to the Property Podcast. It'll tell you everything you need to know and more. It's easy to digest with good humour, and the two Robs make expanding your knowledge in this field easy and enjoyable. This is what podcasts were designed for. Thanks very much, Chris. Well, thank you, Chris. I do appreciate it. Thank you for the review. If you'd like to leave a review, it's super easy. That's a lie. It's not that easy. It's a bit of a faff, but we do appreciate it, and that's why I read it out. You go to iTunes, but if you go to propertyhub.net/podcast, you'll see the link to do it. So we have made it a bit easier for you, but we do appreciate it because it makes a difference.
Yep, it really, really does. And we're going to hope that we don't end up on that complaint resolving website, because that's somewhere that we don't want reviews. Right. Next week, we might have to work on this episode title or start radio editing ourselves or something. It says here in the notes, next week, the topic is how to get done.
We can do rhymes with ship, or you could say stuff for the time being until we get a good bleeper. So how to get stuff done. That's our topic for next week. This, of course, will apply to property investment, because property investment, if you just sit back, nothing's going to happen. You need to take action and make things happen. We'll give you hacks, tricks, tips on how we get the most out of our day. Of course, we do the property podcast, but as you're probably aware, we do a few other things as well. So we have to be super effective with our time. So we're going to give you all the sneaky little tricks and tips that we implement day in, day out to make the most of our time. So I think that should be a really good episode for property investors and others, hopefully, as well. So make sure you tune in for that next week. I think it'll be a really good episode.
Yes, indeed. Well, that is us for another week. Thank you very much for joining us. We will see you next Tuesday morning for Ask Rob and Rob, and then we'll be back next Thursday with that episode that I can't say the name of right now. But thank you again for listening. If you want to check out the show notes for all the links, it's thepropertyhub.net/lettingslaw, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.